Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by Organifi. You guys, one of the only things that every nutritional expert that we've had on the show seems to actually agree on is that we all need to eat more vegetables, eat more greens, eat organic, cut out all the processed junk. Well, who has the time, right? Who has the time to go out, do the shopping, make the salads, make the juices, make the smoothies? And that's what I love so much about Organifi. Their product is an all-organic green juice. It has all of the nutrients that you need. It tastes absolutely amazing, and it's made by wonderful people who I consider to be personal friends. And as listeners of this show, you guys can actually save 20% on your first order. And all you have to do is go to Organifi.com. That's ORGANIFI.com and use the coupon code SUPERHUMAN at checkout. This episode is brought to you by Become a Super Learner, the Masterclass. You guys, if you have ever wanted to learn things faster, to read faster and waste less time reading boring textbooks, if you've ever wanted to have near perfect memory for names, numbers, anything you want to learn, and expand your mind and retain information in a way that you never thought possible, well, then the Become a Super Learner Masterclass is exactly what you've been looking for. It's a 10-week program developed by myself and my mentors alongside some of the world's best memory experts and world record-holding memory champions. It'll take you from zero to super learning hero in just a matter of 10 weeks in about 30 minutes a day or less. Now, you can go ahead and sign up for a free trial with no credit card required. All you have to do is go to jle.vi/learn. And if you choose to pick up the full course, you will also get an incredible discount for listeners of this podcast only. So please make sure to check it out and support the show. And on to today's episode. Greetings, super friends, and welcome to this week's episode. You guys, today we are going to explore a topic that really we haven't explored enough, and that is learning about music. We all know that music is so good for our brains, and we know that there are so many benefits to learning a musical instrument besides looking cool at parties. But how do we do it? And more importantly, how can we do it faster and more effectively? Well, today we are joined by Josh Turknett. He is the author of The Migraine Miracle. We talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, he's a neurologist, and he's the author, and he's a medical editor for the Journal of Evolution and Health. And on top of all that, he's a musician and instrumentalist. He's the founder of Brainjo, which is a system of musical instruction that really incorporates the science of learning and neuroplasticity. And he's just all around a pretty interesting guy. So in this episode, we talk about learning, we talk about migraines a little bit, and then we go into and kind of geek out on the learning behind music. Can anyone learn how to play music? How can you accelerate your learning of music? How does it influence your brain? How does it change your brain? It takes us a little while to warm up and really get into the super nitty-gritty of it, but I think it is going to inspire you, and I think you're definitely going to learn a lot. I certainly got an incredible idea for how I could dramatically improve my memorization of new musical pieces. And it was this common sense thing that I never thought of. So I think you guys will really enjoy that and take a lot of value away from it. So without any further ado, let me present to you Mr. Josh Turknett. Josh, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jonathan. How are you?
Yeah, living the dream, getting towards the end of the day here. So just kind of winding down, looking forward to a stimulating conversation. So Josh, I know that you are engaged in two different things that I want to chat with you about today. So I want to make sure we leave time for both. The first one being just migraines and kind of a method for alleviating those. But then one of the main things that I really, really want to get into, and I hope we'll have time for, is understanding learning, specifically in the context of learning musical instruments. It's something that I've been really engaged in the last year or so. And so I'm looking forward to pick your brain about that. Tell me a little bit first, though, about yourself and your background, how you got to doing what you're doing and kind of what you do.
Sure. So I've kind of had a lifelong interest, or at least, for many years, an interest in the brain. So in my background, my college degree was in behavioral neuroscience. And I ended up sort of taking that and going to medical school and decided that I wanted to be a neurologist. I felt like that would be the domain, at least I initially wanted to apply my interest in the brain. So for the past decade or so, I've been a clinical neurologist. So that's been sort of my day job and the main hat that I wear. But along the way, I've kind of developed a few other interests. And one of those, which kind of pertains to the migraine piece, migraines are a condition that neurologists commonly treat. And I've also suffered with them for much of my life. And several years ago, got real interested in nutrition and particularly in ancestral health, and sort of made some significant changes to my own diet and lifestyle, which made a pretty profound impact on my own migraines, and which ironically, given that that's my area of expertise. And so I began kind of trying to share that with as many folks as I could. Ended up writing a book on the topic, and specifically kind of how to use ancestral health principles and diet and lifestyle to tackle migraines. That was the kind of the spark for my overall interest in the field of ancestral health, which has ultimately led to me kind of pursuing other things outside of my clinical practice and figuring out ways that I can kind of deliver that message and deliver healthcare and make an impact in ways that I can't quite do, in the conventional setting.
Tell me a bit about that. I mean, when you say ancestral health as a treatment for the migraines, what does that actually look like?
So you start with a couple of kind of observations about migraines. One is that they appear to be, like many of the things that we currently face in the clinic, a disease of civilization, meaning that they only emerge in the context of modern diets and lifestyles. And on the other side of that, when you revert to a diet and lifestyle that's more in line with sort of our evolutionary history, or more concordant with the evolutionary past of humans, many of those diseases or conditions either improve or go away altogether, and migraine being one of them. So the specifics of that, in large part are, dietary changes, which I think you're probably familiar with, the removing kind of the foods that have been recently introduced into the human diet, most notably during the Industrial Revolution, but also the Agricultural Revolution. So sort of starting by eliminating those usually makes a huge impact, partly simply through the significant reduction in carbohydrate intake, and particularly refined carbohydrates. So I think one of the reasons why we probably overlooked that as such a significant factor with migraines is because it's so pervasive, right? If everybody's eating the same way, you can't really isolate out that factor since, everybody's doing it. So you tend to focus on less potent things, but that seems to be a huge step towards reversing it, or, lowering the sensitivity towards developing migraines. So that's the diet piece. And then the other piece is, lifestyle. I'm trying to bring that more in line with our evolutionary history. And so specific things like, sleep, sunlight exposure, physical activity, and so on, that's more, in line with what we would have been doing 150,000 years ago rather than what we do in this day and age. And of course, you can never close that gap completely, but kind of the closer you bring it, the better things seem to get.
Incredible. So it really is, it's all the stuff that we've really heard. Not to say it's the same old stuff, but it seems like, we've talked about diets for weight loss. We've talked about diets even for staving off Alzheimer's. We've talked about diets for reversing diabetes. And it really is, it's that same diet. It's cut the sugar, reduce the carbs, cut all the processed crap, and suddenly you are at significantly less risk of having regular migraines.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of the fundamental problem right now in our healthcare system is almost all of what we see nowadays are these diseases of diet and lifestyle, and really emerging because the way we eat, the way we live is out of line with basically what our biology is expecting. So we're placing these, pretty significant homeostatic burdens on the body all the time. And that's leading to these types of diseases. And our healthcare system, evolved or started at a time when this wasn't the case. So it's no longer matched to the problems that we now face.
Right. Wow. Well, I'm really glad that we have another shared topic of discussion that we can get into and maybe go deeper in, because that's a pretty easy fix right there.
It's simple but not easy, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, there are so many books out there. I'm actually reading one right now. I'm reading Rob Wolf's book, Wired to Eat.
Yeah, it's on my list too.
Yeah, I've held off on reading because he was coming on the show to talk about it, and I don't like to have too much knowledge about what a book is about, because then I just get into a channeled discussion. But it really does seem that there is something to be said about helping people get onto these diets, or I don't want to say diets, helping people make these lifestyle changes to where it justifies reading about it, writing about it, stuff like that. So
I was just going to say that actually ties into the next piece about learning, because, really, ultimately what we're talking about is having to get people to make pretty fundamental changes to their behavior. And, knowing what we should be doing is very different than getting people to actually do it. And that's really the real challenge if we're going to make real progress, is figuring out actually how to change people's behavior, and learning is a big piece of that. So.
Yes. So I can tell you've done podcasts before, because that was a very beautiful, smooth segue. So tell me about music. I don't know what happened to me in the last few years. I played guitar a little bit as a kid, as a teenager, I guess I should say. And then I kind of let it go when I broke my hand. And then something happened a couple of years ago, and I suddenly was just drawn to musical instruments. I want to play guitar. I play piano as well now, not well, harmonica. I've picked up some drums. I don't know what's going on with me, but I really would love to learn music faster. And, my piano teacher told me, and this was the last time we spoke, she said, there's no shortcut to learning music. There's no way to learn music faster. And that taught me two things. One, that maybe this world of accelerated learning hasn't reached the music community. And two, that was not the right piano teacher for me. So tell me a little bit about your work in accelerated learning and music.
Sure. So I've been a learning junkie, I think, much of my life. So I've always really enjoyed the process of kind of acquiring a new skill. And early on in my life, that was probably mostly applied to sports. And then as I got older, more into music. And I first started playing music a little bit growing up on the piano and a keyboard. And what I really wanted to do was be able to kind of play by ear, take, stuff I heard on the radio or take stuff I heard in my head, figure out how to play that on the piano. And, I tried to, I sort of dabbled in it myself and got to where I could do a few things, but, I didn't really know how to kind of get it to the next level. And, tried taking lessons from a couple of teachers and, basically said, I really kind of want to learn how to play by ear. Can you do that? And, basically all we did was the same typical method with the same books where you're trying to teach people to learn to read music by rote.
Right.
And so that never got me very far. And so both of those, I didn't stick with any of that for very long and kind of was frustrated by that, whole process. Then years later, as an adult, I started getting into the guitar. And then not long after that, I was gifted a banjo because I'd said for, a few years that one of my goals was to always learn how to play the banjo. And so I got one and I started learning, and kind of, because I had a system for learning things already that came from sports and other domains, I was able to progress pretty quickly. I was using some of the conventional instructional materials, and I ended up, learning some songs that I really wanted to learn, and was kind of progressing at least as faster than I thought I might. But then I kind of hit a wall, and it came actually, I was in a workshop with a professional player who was kind of teaching some various techniques. And after the workshop was over, we were kind of sitting around and, going over some stuff. And he was like, hey, let me back you up a little bit and play something for me. And I sat there and I tried to play for him, took something that I thought I knew really well. And I just couldn't get through it. And it was an intimidating situation, but still it was everything just kind of broke down. And he kept trying to help me, we'll just try a different song, or I'll, play a little slower, and nothing worked. And I was, pretty demoralized after that experience. I thought, how did that happen? How am I able to kind of play this on my own, doing fine, but in this particular scenario, I completely fell apart. And that was kind of when I realized, at that point in time, I had a good background in the world of neurology and sort of how the brain learns and the science of neuroplasticity and how it changes. and kind of realized that what I'd done was sort of constructed a brain or a set of banjo playing neural networks that actually weren't leading me to what I ultimately wanted to do.
Yes, I know that feeling.
So I realized then, how I've been going about it wasn't right because I wasn't mindful of where I ultimately wanted to go. And neither was the instructional materials that I was using. So I kind of realized, I need to start over from scratch, A, and B, I'm going to have to kind of figure this out for myself. How can I design a system? How can I learn this in a way that actually supports my ultimate goal? And that was kind of where sort of the first seeds of what became Brainjo, which is the company I have now that teaches music. And that was kind of where it all began. How can we take sort of a first principled approach to learning music, and specifically sort of how we can go about changing our brains in the way we want to that supports our ultimate goal with learning? And then how can we do so, in a way that's as efficient as possible?
I love that. I've been looking for that. So tell me how it works. I mean, I read a little bit on your site that it's really applying the science of neuroplasticity and everything that you know about the brain and altering the way that the brain works, and then going ahead and applying that to music. So break it down for me and geek out with me a little bit on it.
Yeah. So I think there are kind of two sort of ways to frame the whole learning process. And it applies to pretty much anything, but certainly applies to music. So the first thing is to kind of establish where you headed, and specifically, what's the cognitive system you're trying to build if you're learning to play music. And that's, going to depend on what type of music you're interested in playing. You can think of sort of any complex skill like playing the banjo as sort of a broadly distributed neural network with all these sorts of subnetworks that are feeding into it, right? And your objective over time is to sort of create those networks in a logical order, so that you ultimately end up with the broad top level one that does what you want it. But so it begins by starting out with saying, what does that cognitive system need to do? And in the case of folk music, which is pretty much all styles of music outside of the classical system. So with classical music, your primary goal is to learn to play by rote. So to take music that's printed on a page and translate that into the movement of your limbs so that those printed symbols, right, turn into the sounds of your instrument. So you're basically trying to build mappings between a visual input and the movement of your limbs, right? And that's so that people can coordinate an entire symphony of musicians, make sure they're all doing the same thing. That's a very different type of objective than what you're trying to do with traditions that are outside of that, which are almost all primarily by ear. So you're trying to imagine sounds in the mind and map those onto movements of the limbs. So if you understand that as kind of the ultimate goal, and I describe that as musical fluency. So it's analogous to language fluency, which is basically with language, the goal is to take concepts in the mind, translate that into the movement of the vocal cords so it comes out as speech, and then it can be moved into the brain of another human. Same thing with music. Outside of the classical tradition, taking imagined sounds in the mind, efficiently mapping those into the movement of the hands so that it comes out of the instrument. So then you work backwards, right, to figure out, so what are the set of skills that are needed to do that? And that's not something that a beginner will necessarily, understand. What are all the required, skills needed to get there? And that's where a teacher can help guide that process. But it requires that kind of understanding of where you're ultimately headed to do that. But it's sort of breaking down into all the specific subnetworks that are needed to support that skill in a logical sequence, right? So you want to sort of start with the smallest foundational skill you can, build that up, and move to the next step. So the broad level picture starts out with, figuring out what the ultimate end goal is to the cognitive system that you're going to support. And then you begin the work of working on, all the individual subnetworks. And that's where kind of incorporating the science of how the brain changes can really, I think, accelerate the process a lot. So, one of the simplest, ways that you can learn more efficiently, regardless of domains and including music, is to simply, use your practice time more efficiently. And so, some people practice really effectively, some people don't. And that alone will make a huge difference, from one musician to the next. But the fundamental kind of procedure for working on any type of subnetwork is to, take that particular skill, whatever it is you're working on at any given time, work on that exclusively, and then only move on to the next skill once you've demonstrated that you've sort of created that as a habit, or that you've moved that skill from the conscious to the subconscious mind, and that's a phenomenon known as automaticity. So where you're able to perform a skill without focusing on it anymore. And for me, that's the kind of the primary metric for understanding when it's safe to move on from one skill to the next. So this sort of the learning procedure is basically taking a skill, working on it until it's become automatic or habituated, and then moving to the next skill once you've verified that for yourself.
Mm-hmm. It does kind of make sense. I want to dig a little bit deeper. It's also including how to learn to read music, or it's mostly playing by ear. That part wasn't clear to me.
So it depends on what your objective is, but for most people, it's going to be learning to play by ear. Unless you're going to be playing in a scenario where you're going to have sheet music in front of you and your goal is just to play that sheet music, right? All other scenarios that you're going to want to play in, you actually don't want to have the written notation baked into your playing networks, right? You want to be able to play the instrument independent of any type of written music. So you want to be able to play by ear, which means taking a sound in your mind and playing that on the instrument. So you can use notation in the learning process, but the key there being for the styles that I teach and for the styles that most people I work with want to learn, the key there is to use that mindfully so that it's not integrating into your ultimate banjo playing circuitry. Does that make sense?
It does. I like that as well, because I think too many people focus too much on reading music, and that is the critical skill that's going to allow you to be a musician.
Exactly. And that to me is one of the main reasons why there's such a high failure rate, because people end up learning, they thinking that reading music is the fundamental thing. And then they go to do things that require you to have networks that have nothing to do with reading music, and don't understand why that it's not working. And then they conclude that they just weren't cut out to play music, and so they give up. And that's just a really common scenario.
Which kind of leads into my next question, which is, you talk about on your website, you can take any ordinary adult brain and turn it into the brain of a musician. And so I want to ask, obviously you're specializing in banjo, but I want to ask, how do we go about making our brains more musical? I mean, the average person who's listening, who maybe has another instrument in mind, or maybe wants to sing, how can we make our brains more musical?
So part of it is simply, going through the learning process, and it's starting with believing that you can do it. So, the first step, I think, is to rid yourself of the notion that there are musical people and there are non-musical people. I think we're all musical, and, with the rare exception of people with true tone deafness who are kind of unable to discriminate pitches, and it's a genetic condition. That outside of that, if you don't have true tone deafness, then anybody should be able to learn to play music and learn to play it well. And if you're able to sing or whistle or hum, then you already know you possess networks in your brain that can take sort of an imagined sound and match it to one that you hear, because that's what's required in order for you to sing, right? So, all you're doing is taking sounds that you can imagine in the mind and producing those with either your vocal cords or your lips or whatever, and matching to see if you got it right. If you can do that, you already have the sort of neurological substrates that are needed to learn to do that with another instrument besides the voice, So I think, in my mind, the main limitation, the main reason that people end up not going very far with music is kind of they're unable to kind of let go of the idea that maybe they're just not musical, or that, some people have what it takes and some people don't.
Right. I've actually seen some interesting stuff on just what happens in the brain when we play music. And, that all different centers of the brain light up, and that it is really one of the most rigorous things we can do for our brains. And I guess my next question is the brain of a musician actually different once you've learned these skills? And I imagine it's in a better way, but in what ways is the brain actually different? And how does music develop our brains, make us better thinkers? What does the research say on that?
Yeah, so definitely there are differences in the brains of musicians with non-musicians. And part of that depends too on the specific type, what type of music or genre a person plays. One of the things that's consistently found, which is not too surprising, is sort of the mass of fibers that kind of connects the two hemispheres together is bigger, right? So since you have all this, you have the left and right hands sort of moving in tandem all the time. You're developing, simultaneous movements of the limbs more than the typical person. So the parts of the brain that control that are larger. what you also tend to see is that the difference between non-musicians and musicians in terms of the brain is actually a shift in kind of the cortical networks that are involved with playing music if you're sort of from a beginner to an advanced level. So it actually can shift in many cases from one hemisphere to the other being the dominant one. But I think that overall, the real benefit for learning music, as you mentioned, is definitely one of the most cognitively demanding things that a human does, right? I mean, if you think about all the different processes that are going on, you got both the limbs moving, you're listening to what other musicians are doing, you're taking sounds in your head, mapping them and trying to play them on the instrument. There's a whole lot of things going on. And it's a domain of thought that's kind of different than what you would normally be doing, otherwise in the course of life. So you're developing these cognitive systems that you wouldn't otherwise be using. And, I'm a big fan of doing that sort of thing in general. And I think, what you do with memory and developing those techniques is similar. There's value in doing that sort of thing that sort of transfers beyond just that initial skill set, right? It tends to make all of cognition improve simply because you're sort of building a richer well of connectivity inside the brain. And sort of the more different types of cognitive domains you build, the more ways you have to filter information, more systems that can talk to each other that help with creativity and problem solving and, complex thinking. So I'm a fan of developing all the different cognitive domains we can, because I think that leads to gains in other areas.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, I did want to ask, I mean, you made the connection between memory and music. I've been trying I've sat down for a couple of days and I've tried to map the systems that we teach, Mind Palace and things like that to music. And I've had some success with music that is in 4/4 timing, that has 4 chord, only very specific and rigid things. And it's because music is so varied that any system that I build inevitably doesn't work. It needs to, one day I will develop something, hopefully, but it needs to be something with so much flexibility, so much complexity to account for the fact that you have hundreds of genres of music and, I don't know how many different notes, chords, stuff like that. Do you have any wisdom on that? I mean, how can we memorize music? Say I want to learn a song.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we can go about doing that?
I do. So I think the real key there, and to me, the real difference between people who struggle with memorization and those who don't. I know there are musicians that can just call out thousands of songs at a moment's notice and just play them. That's, just seems magical. And to me, the root of that is the construction or the existence of neural networks that have been built through practice that are able to imagine music in the mind to the movements that they need to play that on the instrument. If you listen to a piece in 4/4 time, and then you listen to a jazz piece with a regular rhythm, and somebody asks you to just kind of hum that back to them, you can do that, right? That's not too challenging. Your brain is actually really good at music and decoding it. And even if you're not able to sort of articulate or understand, how it's doing that. And most people are able to kind of memorize a large library of songs that they can sing, right? You probably have, hundreds of favorite songs that you just give you a cue and you can sing the whole thing to yourself. So the way to remember a bunch of things as a musician is to use that real gift that we have for musical memory by creating the systems that can take those imagined sounds that you can remember and map those into movements of the limbs. So it's creating that particular neural network that allows you to do that. And then you can take advantage of the gifts that you already possess and that we all already possess when it comes to musical memory.
Oh, wow. That's actually really genius. As I was thinking, I kind of heard myself in what you were saying, because I'm always telling people your brain has this incredible ability to memorize all the spaces around you and memorize where things are and create these natural memory palaces, use that. And then at the same time, what I was doing with music is trying to artificially, encode a C or a D or an E minor.
Right.
When in fact, my brain already has memorized any and every song that I would ever want to play on piano, guitar, harmonica, whatever. So all I need to do is then teach myself. Basically, if I can memorize exactly what a G sounds, exactly what an E sounds, then I can just, boom, piece it all together. And I've already memorized all the songs. I love that.
Yeah. So now all you have to do then is build that connection between those sounds in your mind and what you need to do with your hands, right? Because you've already got the memory part.
Wow. That's really clever. That's really, really clever. So I guess it sounds like you would recommend anyone out there start developing their musical ability. What are some great ways for people to get started and actually start developing this musical ability?
I mean, I think, for some, I would say just if there's an instrument or something you've been wanting to do all your life and have been intimidated by it or whatever, just to, get started. If you're looking for, a nice entry point, I think a couple of ways to do so are either the piano or the ukulele, if your stringed instruments are appealing. Those are both ones that have a fairly shallow initial learning curve, and so you can get some rewards early on. My course right now is for anybody who's interested in the banjo, and I teach a couple of different styles. And then we're building a course for fiddle and hopefully some more for other instruments going forward. But so if you have a particular interest in the banjo, you can check that out. But I think that I like the piano because the sort of all of the theory of music is kind of laid out on the piano. So it's a good kind of grounding place for kind of understanding the logic of music.
Yes.
I think all musicians would benefit from at least a rudimentary understanding of how the piano is laid out, because then you can kind of reference everything to that. And then I also like I think the ukulele is a great entry point because you can kind of, with a few little simple chords that are kind of easy to make, you can start, strumming along and playing good music. And I find that once people just are able to prove to themselves that they can make, good sounds on an instrument and it's not as intimidating as they thought, it kind of opens the door and opens their mind to what's possible.
Definitely. So I actually wanted to ask that before. Do you have plans to branch out your products into other instruments? And if not, I guess either way, what are some resources that you recommend if people say, hey, banjo isn't my thing, but I would like to play around with piano? Are there any exceptional programs out there for piano or guitar that you've seen?
I haven't seen anything in particular, but it's been a while since I've looked around in the piano world. So YouTube is a fantastic place for your musicians. You do have to, it's a mixed bag. You can easily find stuff that you can get started with these days on YouTube, either for piano or whatever other instrument. There's probably more for piano than anything else, and perhaps guitar. But yeah, I haven't particularly looked in a while, so I don't have a recommended course or anything for music. But I've thought about branching out into other instruments, including the piano. One of sort of my decisions right now is this sort of methodology is applicable to music, but also to a whole lot of other things. And so whether or not to kind of expand beyond the realm of music and kind of develop this as a universal learning system that can be, to show people how to apply it to virtually anything. So trying to decide which direction to go for the future in that regard.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely look forward to that if you do have plans to put some of that stuff out. I guess I wanted to ask you if there are any other kind of mental hacks. I mean, I know we barely touched on your background in neuroplasticity and stuff like that. Are there any other kind of major hacks that you really believe in, that you really use for improving memory, improving learning, or just overall kind of becoming superhuman?
There are several hacks. One of my favorites is visualization, and it's particularly useful for music, in my opinion. So I wrote a piece about this a while back, and I likened visualization, which basically means, imagining yourself playing without your instrument, akin to using the force, because you can actually change the structure of your brain, doing nothing more than thinking about playing, which is, pretty magical when you think about it. So what I recommend people do, it's particularly useful if you have something in particular that you're struggling with. So if it's a few measures in a song or a technique, to visualize yourself playing that and do so using the first person perspective. So one thing we know of is that simply, and this applies to music as well as other domains, simply visualizing yourself doing something activates the same brain regions that doing that particular activity does. So you can get almost the same, if not the exact same benefits from visualization practice as you can with regular practice. So visualizing yourself doing something that's particularly challenging for you is a great way to take advantage of that, even when you're not with your instrument. And another way to kind of add on to that is to do it right before you go to sleep. So
definitely,
one of the things we learned about sleep is that, one of the primary functions, right, is for learning and memory. And when the brain is deciding kind of what to work on overnight, it tends to give preference to the things that were done, closer to sleep, closer to bedtime. So visualizing something that you're working on right before bed is a great way to kind of cue the brain to say, hey, this is what I want you to work on tonight and, be a little bit better at the next morning. I think that's to me, a super cool technique, and it's something you can do at any point in time. I do it when I'm driving. I do it, when I'm walking around. I'm visualizing many times, whether I'm even consciously meaning to or not. That's one of my favorite techniques.
That's a really, really solid kind of tip and trick, and a great way to utilize kind of dead time.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Josh, I want to be respectful of your time. So I want to give you an opportunity to let people know where they can reach out to you. I know you have 2 different products. Where can people learn more, get in touch?
Yeah. So I think the best place to see what I'm up to is jturk.net. So jturk.net. That will link into the Brainjo, which is the music instruction method, as well as the migraine site and ancestral health. And then the newest project that I'm working on, which is called the Optimal Brain, trying to design systems for optimizing cognitive function and brain wellness. So that's a good launching point for all of those places.
Awesome. We didn't even get to chat so much about that. Tell me just the tidbit about the brain optimization, if you would.
Yes. So one of the things I mentioned before that I've gotten really into ancestral health and wanting to figure out sort of how to use that expertise and how to deliver, solutions in that regard to people in ways that I can't really do inside of the traditional medical system. So the Optimal Brain is a project kind of designed to help people optimize cognitive functioning using both sort of ancestral health principles and these principles of learning and accelerated learning. So I think that one of the most notable things for me that happened after moving, adopting kind of an ancestral approach was a pretty significant increase, in mental clarity, energy levels, which had a big impact on productivity and creativity and so on. So, when we talk about, optimizing cognition, it's important to make sure that piece is in order. And there's so much low hanging fruit there from optimizing sort of the biological function of the body and the brain before you even move on to the accelerated learning stuff. So
totally.
Yeah. So the idea there is to first optimize the biological system and then put on top of that systems for continuous learning and cultivating the conditions for, idea generation and creativity.
I love that. And when can we expect to see that product come out?
The site was just launched. So that's the optimalbrain.net. And the system that I'm going to be offering, it's called Elite Cognition. The hope to launch in the next month or so. So if you go to that site, you can sign up to my list there and get notified when that's ready.
Awesome. And chances are by the time you guys hear this, that website should be open and running, hopefully.
Yeah.
Very cool. A manual for elite cognitive performance. So that's really cool. I'm going to be checking that one out. And maybe in the next time we speak, we can definitely talk about that and talk a little bit about enhancing the brain and its performance.
Yeah, fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Josh, I really want to thank you for your time. It's definitely been super fascinating for me. And I renewed my interest in learning music because of all the magical benefits. So I really do appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm happy to be with you. And I'll just say that I was excited to learn about your podcast not too long ago. And I'm having fun binging on past episodes since we clearly share a lot of the same interests. So
awesome. Well, let's make sure that we do keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, my friend. You take care.
All right, you too.
All right, super friends, that is all we have for you today, but I hope you guys really enjoyed the show and I hope you learned a ton of actionable information, tips, advice that will help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or drop us a quick little note on the Twitter machine at GoSuperhuman. Also, if you have any ideas for anyone out there who you would love to see on the show, we always love to hear your recommendations. You can submit on our website or you can just drop us an email and let us know. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.